What is going on, everybody? It is Bush Fishing, and we are back. We're in the shop, and we have something very special. Now, you guys haven't seen a video in a while. I tried the ice fishing, I got super busy, but we're finally back, and we're going to be continuing the boat build series, so if you want to see that, make sure to subscribe. Look at the other videos. We pretty much got most of it done last year, but this year we've got some finalizing things and some extra sick things to add to the boat. But one of the things I got for the boat is this here rig. This is a 1983 Evinrude 75 horse. Now, this is the newest motor I've ever owned, and I was super excited to pick this up. The guy was super nice, and I got it for a great price, and it was in really good condition, but there's some things that I need to go over, which is what this video is about. This video is going to be how to clean the carburetors on your Evinrude. This is for 3 cylinders. It could be from 65 horse up to 75, and it covers a lot of year ranges, so I'll probably have that in the title or in the thumbnail, but the main thing is it has trim tilt. Hydraulic, electric, trim tilt. None of my motors have ever had this, and I already did some work to this motor. I wish I would have recorded it. It actually probably would have been pretty good, but let me get this cowling off and I'll show you what I've done already. Oh, big girl. Okay, so first let me give you a demonstration. From the factory, it has the trim tilt in the controls, which when you push the button, the motor goes up and down. We're just getting off the trim rams now, and then you get into the tilt ram. So from the factory, you only have the option to use this button. Now, what I added is I wired in this whole harness, added a plug here so it's removable, harness goes up, and basically the main thing here is these 2 relays. Now, this is the best place I could find to mount it. I don't know if that's going to be the final location, but if you'll follow my wiring and the harness that I made, you come over here to this switch. Now, I have an actual trim tilt switch with an up-down, but you can see there that we have another switch which didn't come from the factory, and this is going to be for like putting the transom saver on so you don't have to run back and forth between the controls. The other thing was this water fitting right here was broken off, so I added a new hose that was all cracked and that new fitting from marineengine.com. And lastly, when I first got this motor, it had a no spark condition, which after some actually really quick diagnostics, I found out it was the key switch. There's a wire coming from direct ground into the pin on the key switch, and then from that pin it goes into the neutral safety switch, and then through the harness to the motor. And all that really does is when your key is off, it grounds out ignition, so there's no spark. And the problem I had were the 2 wires go next to each other, and they actually got pinched by the bolt that holds the 2 halves of the controls together. So after a quick fix there, we got spark in the motor. Now, originally I didn't plan on cleaning these carbs. They looked in really good condition, but after pulling the drain plugs on them and seeing how dirty the fuel was that was in there, I'm gonna go ahead and do it. I've done the same thing on my 70 horse over there, which I'll show you in a second, but I figured it would make a good video because there's not a lot on YouTube about these, and it is pretty simple and you can do it yourself, and I'm gonna go through every step of the way. Let's get into it. I'm gonna get set up and then we'll start taking this motor apart. Alright, so how I'm gonna have this laid out is I have my 3 pieces of white ball here, and I got a label top, middle, and bottom. That's important to keep the carbs separated and put them back where they go. The other thing, I'm going to have to turn this heat off in a second once I start getting fuel everywhere, but for now I'm going to warm up the shop. So, let's start out here. Here is your primer solenoid. So, when you turn the key and push it in, hopefully you can hear that clicking. In here there's a solenoid with a plunger. When you push the key in, the plunger goes down and it allows a new fuel path to go into the carburetors for cold starting. That fuel comes off the main fuel line here, goes in through the middle and bottom carburetor into the primer, and then it has 2 outputs. One of the outputs goes through, back up, tees off here, goes into the top of the middle carburetor and the top of the upper carburetor, and it goes in past the throttle plate so you have direct fuel into the reeds and into the intake. The other output of the primer, which you'll see when I take it apart, goes straight down to the bottom carburetor. So that's the whole primer circuit. We don't have to take the primer off, but we are going to take the primer lines off, and from there we're going to take the fuel lines off, and then from there we're pretty much good to unbolt it, take off the throttle linkage, which this linkage is much easier than the other styles with the choke. There's a lot less and you really only have to pop these 3 out, and it's super hard to mess up. So I'm going to grab some tools and we'll get into it. Okay, so to begin with, I'm going to leave the hoses attached to the primer because that's pretty hard to get to. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect it. The main fuel from the primer into the fuel line, or from the fuel line into the primer, I'm going to disconnect this line. Now, that's exactly what'll happen. You'll break the plastic on these T's. Luckily, I have some, and I should be able to find some, but you'll break that plastic, and then if you're out on the water, you're kind of screwed. But this is an older motor, so these things happen. Next thing I'm going to do, since that is free, the fuel into the primer, we don't really have to do anything. I don't even know if I need to take that off, but we're going to disconnect the primer lines from the top of each carburetor. These shouldn't break because they're cast into the carburetor, but I'm just using a needle nose pliers and pulling these lines off. You don't have to do this right now. You can do this later in the process, but this is going to give me some more room to show you guys what's going on. So as you can see, this one comes from the primer, goes to the top two, and the last one down here, you probably won't be able to see it now, but it goes straight to the other output of the primer. Next up, we're going to need to take the fuel lines off. So these just had the zip tie hose clamps on them. I already cut those preparing to make this video, but grab it with the pliers, twist it a little bit. Try not to grab it too hard because you can break the hose if you're not going to put new ones on, which I think I'm going to bust these. Yep, so I ripped that hose, but I'm going to end up putting new hoses on all this. Kind of didn't want to do, but it's going to have to be done because these old hoses are, yeah, pretty much rotted to nothing. Now, another thing I'll say, I don't have a carb kit for this. I didn't intend on needing to use new gaskets, because just from looking at these on the outside, they seem like they're okay, and judging by the paint on the nuts that mount the carburetors on, I don't think anyone's ever been in here, so it would probably be a good idea for me to put new gaskets in it, but for now, we're just gonna leave it. Okay, now with the fuel lines off and the primer lines off, these carbs on this side are clear to come off. We have access to the 3 nuts on this side that are holding them in. Now moving on to the starboard side of the motor, we need to get this throttle linkage out of the way. So what I'm going to do, you see this rod, and there's a little plastic fitting in here. You might be able to do it by hand just like that, but the rod pushes out. I'm going to leave it. Okay, it actually came out of all 3. Just take note of the orientation of it, and we're going to put that off to the side. Now, with the throttle linkage out of the way, we have access to the 3 nuts on this side, so we're pretty much ready to start taking these off. That's why I was saying these are so easy to work on. Next tool you're going to need is a 1/2-inch open wrench. What you're going to do, grab the nuts on each side, crack them loose. These are actually pretty loose. One thing I'm going to say, a tip, loosen one side a little bit, loosen the other side a little bit, and do it evenly. And you'll see why in a moment here. If you back one nut all the way out, you won't be able to pull the carb out. You need to do one at a time, pull the carb back, and then keep doing it because you don't have the space from this pin to that nut to get it out. So once you crack them, they should be pretty much good to come out by finger, and just evenly take them out, pop the carburetor back, and then keep going. Now, if your carburetor's stuck, you might need to give it a little pop or a little hit with a nylon hammer. This one I just did by hand, but you'll know you're going to need a carb kit if this gasket doesn't come off clean. So this is where it mounts to the manifold. If you have pieces of this gasket left, you're going to need a new gasket. You're going to need to clean this all off super well, but for now, look at that. Top carburetor is already off. You're going to set it on the top side. Keep the nuts in here. If you're working in a place you don't want to get fuel, I would open this drain up and drain the fuel out. You're going to have fuel in this bowl. I already have done that. Just let it drain out of the motor, but we're going to keep moving on. Next carburetor, with the top one off, you have more access to the middle one. And same thing for the bottom one. So when you reinstall these, you're going to want to do bottom, middle, then top. Little pop with the fist and it cracked right off. Second one came off with the gasket still intact, so that's pretty good. Let's keep moving on to the bottom one. Before we get into that, you'll see now the primer circuit. So these hoses are actually pretty chafed, so I'm going to need some new ones. But you can see you have the input fuel coming off the main fuel line, and then you have... Fuck, I didn't even need to take that off. Now I broke it. Input fuel going into the primer, and your 2 outputs. Bottom output goes straight to the top of the bottom carb, and your top output goes into the upper and middle carburetor. Same process with these. The bottom one's going to be a little bit trickier to get to, especially if you have the controls hooked up, but it still is possible. A little tip, if you push the throttle linkage down, it gives you a little more space to get in there, and you're going to have to turn your wrench. Either way, get it on a little angle, whatever you need to do to get this nut loose. Alright, we're going to start with our top carburetor. As you can see, this one's a little bit dirty in there. What I actually want to see is, so these are fixed jet carburetors, so This is your main, not your main jet, but this is your fuel air mix screw. That one is turned in all the way, no matter what. There is no adjustment on it. We'll get into the other jets once we get there, but for now, we're going to flip the carburetor upside down. You're going to see these 4 flathead bolts. You're going to take your flathead screwdriver, of course, crack each one loose, and run them out. Wish I had one of those electric screwdrivers. If anyone wants to donate, please do. Now, I'm going to take note that this plate is in this front right corner, if you're looking at it. That plate doesn't need to be on there, it's just cool to have. If anyone wants to donate one of those electric screwdrivers, let me know. Alright, with those 4 out, I'm going to give this a little whack with the screwdriver. Just like that, and that's in hopes of saving the gasket. Now, we are free on most corners. The gasket's stuck a little bit right here, so I'm going to pry that up with my finger and hopefully not rip it, even though it looks like I might need new ones. And holy jeebus. Good thing I pulled these apart, hey fellas? This is where I'm going to turn the heat off. Alright, so obviously these carbs did need a clean. Your main jet, your high-speed jet, is located right in the bottom of this. You have access to it through the drain plug, but that's not going to run good like that. And we want this baby running good, so the first time we get out on the water, we're able to rip and see how much faster this new motor is. But this is the float. So how this works is, normally your carburetor sits like this. When your carburetor is empty of fuel, there's no fuel in the bowl, your float sits like this. Now, right here, fuel comes in from where we took that hose off. It goes in through a cavity and up through this float pin. You'll see it better in a second, but basically when it's like this, it's not sealed right here, so fuel can enter the bowl. As your fuel fills up the bowl, this float floats on the fuel, of course, and when it gets up to a level with the mounting surface of the top of the carburetor, it closes off. So now no more fuel can get in, your bowl is filled, and then as you run and it empties, the float comes back down, fills up with more fuel, and it keeps it full like that. Really good design. So now what we're going to need to do is take a pick or something, and we're going to push this float pin out. So this is plastic, so be careful with it, but just like that, I push the end out, and I'm going to pull it with my fingernails the rest of the way. Really stuck, but now that that's out, we're free to lift up on this float, and as you see, the float pin comes out. The older style doesn't have, I really apologize, it's been a long day of work and then coming home to this, but the needle doesn't normally have that pin on the older styles that hold it up. It's based on the pressure of the fuel to push the pin out, making sure everything's good. This is a better design because even if this is stuck a little bit, when the float comes down, saying that it's empty, it'll actually pull the pin up, so you have to get fuel in. So for now, we're going to put that off to the side. You can see better now, this is where your fuel comes in from this barb, so fuel goes through here, into that. Over here is your main jet, and how this works, as you're running, piston comes down, it's going to create negative pressure here, that's going to suck air through the carburetor, and that creates a low pressure, and that low pressure wants to push the atmospheric pressure of the bowl up through here into the venturi and then into the motor. The faster you go, the more vacuum that's made here. It's going to be sucking here, so it's going to be pushing fuel up into that. So let's get into cleaning it. Now, the float seat can be taken out and inspected and cleaned. There is a gasket. If it doesn't want to break loose, I'm not going to force it. There's another gasket at the bottom here. That one looks pretty okay, but this is basically the top of the carburetor. As you can see, there's a bunch of gunk in there. We're going to clean all of this out. Down here into the actual float bowl, I'm going to crack the drain plug loose. Once you have it out, inspect the gasket around it, and you'll see there's a bunch of gunk in here. Now, the tool that I use for this is, it's real simple, but they're torch tip cleaners. For an oxyacetylene torch to clean the holes out, you get a bunch of these long little needles, and they're really good for cleaning out these carbs. Hopefully you'll be able to see this when I go in here. Oh, the amount of resistance on this is horrible. So hopefully you can see the needle down in the hole there, but that's how you're going to clean these jets out. Now hopefully you can see it better. I'm going to put the needle into where the primer line goes. Stop shaking so much, and I believe it is a one-way valve, so you can only push into it, you can't pull out, so it doesn't create a vacuum leak, but it comes out right there and squirts fuel directly into the intake. So that's one carburetor. I'm going to take the rest of these apart, and then we'll get into how to clean them. Alright, so before getting into cleaning them, the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take out that fuel air mixture screw. So crack it loose, unwind it all the way, and we'll get into how it works. So there's a gasket behind it. Normally on a fuel air mixture screw, you'd see a really fine point. And when you turn it in all the way, that point is making the most contact with the back and restricting the most airflow. And what that does is it creates more of a vacuum for fuel since you're restricting the air. It's just like a choke. These are fixed jet, so they're just a screw that goes in, but that is another track that can get clogged up, so I'm going to leave that out. Now we're going to get into talking about the two main types of cleaning. I'm going to categorize soaking them into one big category because you can either do what I'm going to do, soak these in carb cleaner, which is for when they're really nasty like this, and it's going to soak in that almost like an acid. It's not an acid, but it's going to soak in that, and it's really going to eat away at all this gunk that's in here and get in every single crevice. Now, the other way is an ultrasonic cleaner, which still goes to soaking them. It gets soaked in a solution, but the actual machine cleans it for you, and you can do it in like an hour, and it works extremely well. I don't have one of those, so I'm going to be soaking it in carb cleaner. If your carbs were nice and clean and you were in a pinch, maybe out on the water, and you had a can of carb cleaner, you could go through and you're going to be spraying every orifice you possibly can. So fuel in here, down the tube here, this entire bowl, through the idle circuit, you're going to be cleaning that. You're going to be cleaning the primer circuit. Pretty much everything you can see, clean through it. And the most important one is going to be down in this bowl and down in the jet that's inside of there. That is the most important one. What I do is I squirt straight in through the drain. I squirt through, it'll come up here, squirt here, it'll come out, and you'll get all the gunk out. You can also take a toothbrush and scrub the majority of the actual built-up stuff. But I'm going to show you what I'm going to do for the sake of this video. So this is a can of gunk parts cleaner. It's basically the same thing as the carb cleaner spray, just a little bit different. But it comes in a can like this, just like a paint can. And what you do is you crack it open. Normally there's a little kind of tray thing that goes in there and you can pull out. But once you have all the gaskets off and anything rubber, you really don't want to put rubber into this because it'll eat it away. I kind of want it to eat away at this little piece of hose that's left in there. But all you're going to do is literally... Oh, look at all that gunk that came out of there. You're basically just going to throw the entire carb in the entire float bowl. I have the drain out because there's a gasket in there. And what this is going to do is it's going to soak around and get in every single piece of this carburetor. Now, you're probably going to wonder, how are you going to know which carb is which? I'm going to take a paint pen. So this is 2. So I'll write on this one number 2. I'll write 3 on this one. I'm going to make a better 2 on this so I can actually identify it. If you do, for whatever reason, mix it up, you can identify it by the linkage on it. You'll notice this one has the roller on it. So this one's going to be the middle carb, and the top and bottom one are pretty similar. But it's not crazy important, but it is for me. So drop the other one in here, drop the other bowl in here, and you're going to have to be a little bit creative with how you fit all these in here. I have a second one, but I'm going to try and get them all into one, since this one's newer and cleaner. And lastly, the last float bowl with no drain in it. And you can already see all the shit that's coming up on it. So basically, I'm going to cover that, and I'm going to leave it sit for 24 hours. You can let that sit as long as you want. I'm just going to do 24 hours because I am super busy with this motor. And actually on the boat too, I planned on doing the lower unit video tomorrow, how to change the impeller and do the water pump. I already have the water pump kit. Having these carbs off is going to make it much easier because that bolt right there is the linkage for the gear selector, the shift rod. When you have the carbs on, this can be a bitch to get to. With it off, I'm going to do it with it off. It's going to make it so much easier. And especially for one person doing this, going to make it a hell of a lot easier. So if you want to see how to do the impeller, stay tuned for the next video. But for now, I'm going to let these carbs soak, and I will be back with you guys tomorrow. Alrighty everybody, let's finish up this video. So I just finished the water pump. Now we're going to go have a look at these carbs. So these have actually sat for 2 days now, and let's have a look. I got the rubbers on today. Jesus. You see that? You remember how black and gummed up those were? That is incredible. So, I believe that's the bowl for 3. I just realized I forgot to mark the bowls. This is carb 3, which is lower carb. Wow, that looks incredible. So I'm gonna get all these drained out and sitting on the rags. There's gonna be a lot of fluid in these. Wow, those butterflies move so much smoother. Okay, so those are all looking very nice. It's weird to kind of see. I forgot to take out the drain of this bowl, and you can actually see there is still a little bit of stuff left in it, so we're going to have to take a little extra time cleaning that, but that's how the soaking works of the carbs. I mean, it took almost everything off. We're going to have only a little bit to do spraying and scrubbing. Okay, so we're going to start from the top down. I'm going to take my torch tip cleaner, shove it in, see if there still is anything left in there, but you can see how much easier that's going in there just because all that crap's out of there, all the stuff that sits in the bottom of the bowl. That's the worst spot because everything's going to sit right there. So we're going to go through every hole on these main jets, make sure everything's cleaned up, but everything looks really, really good. Again, I'm shoving the tip anywhere fuel goes through. It's like this primer circuit, main fuel into the bowl, through the float seat. Okay, so now that most of these are cleaned out, I'm going to grab a can of carb cleaner. I'm going to take them over to a drain. I just have this where all my old oil and stuff goes, but you're gonna spray all the stuff from the tank out, spray through every orifice. You pretty much just hit with the torch tip cleaner. You can see I'm spraying in the float seat and it's coming out the fuel in. That's exactly what you want to see. I'm going to go through the fuel in and you'll see if there's a hole here, if you plug that up, you can see it coming out of the fuel in. So now we're going to have fuel to the bowls. Alright, so let's begin reassembling these carbs. I'm going to start with the top, go to the bottom. Where should we start? Let's put this gasket on. This gasket goes over the pickup to the venturi. That one goes on there. Next up, let's do the float. So this is where it gets interesting, being as shaky as I am right now. So your float needle hangs on there just like that. What you're going to have to do, make sure the tab is down on the end of the float, because otherwise it'll be upside down. It'll run, but it'll make you think there's other issues. Needle goes in just like that. You can pretty much set it down. Then you're going to grab the float pin, get it started in the hole, and it's going to have to go through one or the other. Put them all the same way though. And then you're going to lift up on the float and get the hole aligned to where this pin starts going in. You're going to have to mess with it a little bit. And once you get it through the other side, just make sure it's fully seated. Now, a way to check if your float's going to seat is by, you're going to blow on the fuel in port and you're going to put your finger over this hole right here. This is just a little diaphragm for it to collect fuel. When it's like this, when the carb's upside down, it should be sealed. There should be no air able to push through. And when you go like that, there should be fuel able to get through. So let's try it. I couldn't really show you that, but you could hear it when I lifted up on the float. It could get through. So that float is working. It's good. Next up, we're gonna get the float gasket on here. Obviously, I would always recommend getting an entire carb kit, but I did not. And we're gonna find out if these, they are directional. I was just really stupid about that. So get it on there, sit it, have it sitting lined up, take a look around, make sure you're not missing anything. Then grab the rest of the float bowl, sit it on top of there, get the holes lined up, and then pinch it. Pinch it with one hand, and then you're going to start running bolts into it. I don't really remember where that plate went, but we're going to find out. And once they're sitting on there, flathead screwdriver, run them in, make sure they're going down straight. Just snug them up at first. So as soon as the heads touch, I'm going to stop, go to the next one. I'm going to go opposite corners to seat them, and then final torques, they're going to go opposite corners, then one time around. You can do the same thing now without your finger over the hole. If you blow into the fuel in with it upright, you should be able to get air through because there's no fuel in the bowl. And then if you hold it upside down and blow through, you shouldn't be able to get air. I just tested that, and it worked. I'm going to scrape all this crap off in a second once I finish. Alright, so these are ready to be installed back on the motor now. I put brand new gaskets on. That's the perks of having a grandpa that worked for Evinrude his whole life. All new gaskets. I got these brass T-fittings, the little plastic ones that I broke. I replaced them with brass. These are going to be much better. I'll put a link in the description to where I got them. They came in less than 24 hours off Amazon, but they also came with the clamps, so everything's hose clamped now. The last thing I need to do is put the fuel in hose back on and hose clamp that. That was from doing the dropping the lower unit. But we're going to install these carbs and hook everything back up, and then we should be ready to test this thing out. So starting from the bottom, cleaned up this surface. Now the primer lines are going to go on top, and we're going to have to, basically what you're going to do is you're going to put the carb on just to where the threads are exposed on the studs, and then you're going to get your nut in there and just get it started. One thread, that's pretty much it. You're going to have to push it in and out a little bit, but that one just started. Now I'm going to come to the other side. I'm going to push the throttle linkage down a little bit. Hopefully you guys can see this. This one's the hardest one to do just because you have the primer in the way and the shift cables, shift and throttle. But once you get those started, okay, so 2 of those are started. Now you can tighten them up, and at the same time you're going to be pushing the carb in until it's fully seated. So now that those are as tight as we can get them, we're going to grab our 1/2-inch open wrench and we're going to go side to side with these. You want these to go evenly so you get a nice squeeze on the gasket. And then the top one's going to be even harder to see, so I will skip that, and then after we'll hook up the fuel lines. Okay, so there's 4 lines going into this big harness. This second to last one is going to go through the bottom and hook up to the primer. I should have hooked that up first. I don't know why I didn't. Kind of fish it through there, and right on this side it should pretty much line up with the barb. Make sure it's pressed on all the way. So that one's hooked up. Now we can go to the fuel lines. These, since I made them a little longer, kind of got a little wonky. I'm going to use my remaining 2 clamps on the bottom and the middle carb, and then I'll get another clamp for the top one, but these are small little clamps that came with the T-pieces. Obviously, they come with zip ties from the factory, but I just want to make sure I don't have a fuel leak because I am afraid of starting on fire. Okay, so with the fuel lines connected, I'll tighten those clamps up in a second, but we're going to take our primer lines, which are hiding back here. I'm just going to run them the same way as the fuel line. They connect right on top of that carb, right at the intake. Just push those over. Those aren't as important to be clamped, but you do want to make sure they go on there and they're seated all the way. That one's done. Now we just got the top one. Okay, so with those connected, you want to make sure that these can be pushed back so they're not in the way of the airbox, but they shouldn't be like this. I feel really good about that. So now I'm going to tighten up these clamps. Hopefully I can fit them in here. What I'm going to do is grab just one bolt in a relatively easy spot, and I'm going to grab the gasket, and I'm going to put the gasket with the bolt on. The gasket's kind of going to hold the bolt, but I'm going to do a top one, and then I'm going to do a bottom one, just like that. Now, hell, I'll even do a middle one since it seems to be holding the bolt well. 5/16. I'm going to grab a ratchet and an extension. We're going to hook the hose up to the bottom of this, which this can be kind of difficult. We're going to tighten all of them up. Okay, next up we're going to grab those 1/4-inch bolts. We're going to slide the airbox cover on top, make sure it's lined up. I'm just going to put a corner bolt in so I can kind of pivot it. They're not really bolts, they're kind of like tappers, but grab all of these and our ratchet with a 1/4-inch on it and run them down. Just kind of get the 2 started and then go all the way around. Okay, so with all of those connected, give it a real good look over. Make sure everything looks good. Make sure no lines didn't get fully connected. Make sure everything's tight, and then you pretty much are ready to hook up fuel and see how it starts. Obviously, I still use the primer, but yeah, that's pretty much it. So I need to get some fuel, get the muffs back here. We will see if I start it today, but if not, we'll probably end up closing out this video. Alright, I believe we got fuel pressure. We got the tack hooked up. I'm going to use the primer and let's see if she starts.